welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's me, Diana.
And
Nice
it's me, your friend Jackie from Vacation Land. Not the real Vacation Land, though. The fake Vacation Land.
What's the real Vacation Land?
Maine.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Oh, right.
I'm not in Maine. After I said it, I'm like, I'm not in Maine. I'm in the opposite of Maine.
We're all in an unusual location, actually.
That's right. And by all, usually we start off on this podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. We talk about relevant topics, relevant articles. Sometimes we have a great guest. But before we start talking about some of the differences with our recording, let's make sure one of, not exactly a difference, but a happy situation we find ourselves in. We have a special guest on, and it's a special guest that many of you have heard before. Special guest. It's Alan Haberman.
That's right. Alan Haberman, book club guy, coming to you for this very special conversion therapy episode.
Woo, woo.
Hooray. I guess.
Yes. Well, we're glad to have you.
As Rob implied, it's usually a special guest, but it's just Alan this time, so maybe not so special.
You can be a special guest, Alan. It's not a book club.
Yeah, if you go back and review what you said, you implied that I wasn't special. So
my goodness.
I'm just pointing that out.
No, I double negative my intro. You are special.
You are actually very special.
Oh, well, thank you. You're all special.
Thank you. Well, we're very excited to have you here, Alan. This is going to be a follow-up episode. Like you said, we're going to be talking about ethics, an ethics episode, and it's a live episode, but we're going to be following up on an episode we did on LGBTQIA+ and the history of behavior analysis. Not necessarily, it's a fact that was not supportive of that community. And we had an episode of this 219. We talked with Dr. Sarah Campow and Dr. Matt Capriati about the expression of concern for one of the articles in a behavior analytic journal on conversion therapy, the Riekers and Lovas 1973. It is the only expression of concern in related research based on the topic of conversion therapy. So this is a follow-up where we're going to continue the discussion of the other articles that were mentioned in some of the follow-up articles, but do not have expressions of concerns. And we're going to talk about the ethics behind what went wrong with those articles so that we can avoid ever finding ourselves in such a similar situation. And not just in relation to, say, conversion therapy, which you would have to go out of your way to actively avoid everything that we've learned or knew then or refused to acknowledge then. So it's more, how do we avoid ever getting in a similar type situation where a group is harmed by behavior analysis? So that is what we are going to do today on this episode. Let's get started, shall we? Oh, did you elbow me? We're all in different places as well. So this is a tough topic.
I was trying to say that before.
I know. And I started with the intro and this is what happens, the stimulus control of my podcasting behavior. No one is in the place that they usually record from. So that's going to be a little extra wrinkle. And we're talking about a sensitive ethical topic. So great.
For us, our studio is getting rebuilt. So we are in our bedroom. Mm-hmm. Hopefully the acoustics are good. Jackie, where are you?
I'm also in a bedroom in Florida that is not my own, at an Airbnb.
Nice. Alan?
I'm in a home office /gym/guest bedroom that belongs to my sister. So
fantastic.
Your sister's got it made, man. When she's got all of those things in one place, that's amazing.
One-stop shop.
Exactly.
All right, I'm ready to tell you the episodes. Is that what you were all waiting for?
No, not what we were waiting for.
I mean, the articles.
Yeah, so if you are watching this live, you get to see some fun backgrounds. We tried to blur them, and it didn't work very well because Diana got blurred out.
I even some of the article titles I think are problematic. Yeah. So we just wanted to issue like a content warning saying that we are going to be talking about articles that include very outdated terminology, very outdated assumptions, and just horrifically and frankly immoral and unethical research about what essentially is queer and transgender identities. It applies to everyone in the LGBTQIA community, but specifically, this is some content that evolves around trans identities and trans bodies, especially children that were showing tendencies, as they might say in this research. So we don't endorse this terminology. We're just talking about it in the historical context. But just be prepared if you're going to listen further, because it is very awful 1970s medical, psychological, pathological assumptions about being not cis het, basically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alan. So this episode, again, stemmed from that earlier conversation, which, Alan, you were a part of as well. So we're glad to have you back to continue the conversation. And I think one of the areas where behavior analysts could be considered doing better was to speak out about other previous topics. And so pretty much what we've got in this episode is it's not every single article related to the idea of either conversion therapy or relating to conversion therapy in some way, published by or supported by research done by behavior analysts, but they are the articles that were discussed or were pointed out in some of those other articles from that previous episode. Let's make sure we cover those, talk about maybe why they don't or should have an expression of concern published about them. And also we had two articles that were discussed sort of as the positive light of, looking at how so many individuals were sort of anti-trans, anti-homosexual, and so much of their research seemed to stem from a belief system that supported that belief itself. And how even in the 70s, this wasn't just an issue of like, well, people just didn't know any better. Like, how are they supposed? Times have changed. Because even in the 70s, there were real strong critics of the Riekers and Lovaas article, and we could assume would extend to much of the other research we'll be talking about. And so that was, Nordyke and Baer and Winkler. So those articles were also published. So we wanted to make sure that we gave them a little bit more discussion, because I think they kind of had now been cited as, but some people disagreed, and then that's all they get. There's some people who disagreed, but we wanted to talk more about to see what their specific argument was at the time that we can bring to our discussion today. So
do we briefly want to talk about the terms and then the art? Because I think the terms are used in the titles.
Let's do that. Yes.
I have just a brief summary of each term that I pulled from Science Direct plus the reading. Sex typing or sex type behaviors, which are just behaviors that are societally associated with your assigned birth sex. Cross-gender, which is a phrase meaning engaging in behaviors associated with the gender not assigned at birth. Note the gender dichotomy that's strongly in place here. It's important to note that the phrase cross-gender is usually then followed by the word boy or girl or man or woman, but that its use, at least in these articles, is misgendering, because it talks about someone who's a cross-gender boy is someone who we would probably say identifies as a trans woman. So this is a awful term in and of itself from my perspective. There's another phrase, gender disturbance, which is an older diagnosis of having motivations to engage in cross-gender behaviors and or to seek medical transition, which became gender identity disorder when we started to be more accepting of trans identities, now called usually gender dysphoria. There's the term transsexualism, also outdated, referring to the specific desire to live as the opposite quote unquote sex from which one is assigned at birth, and to medically transition specifically in some cases. Transvestism, which is dressing or performing as the opposite sex, regardless of one's medical status. And then the phrase homosexual, which in contemporary or at the time use is based on the assigned at birth rather than one's identity. So someone who was assigned female at birth would be a homosexual for engaging with relationships with someone who was also assigned female at birth, regardless of what those individuals identified as. So just reviewing those.
Perfect.
So
good. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And so now that we have our more current definitions in place, let's go over what our articles are, because many of those terms are not going to be used correctly in our article titles.
Alrighty. So we've already given a preface, so I'll just read the titles. Fading to Increase Heterosexual Responsiveness in Homosexuals by Barlow and Agris. That was published in JAMA 1973. Identifying Specific Erotic Cues in Sexual Deviations by Audio Tape Descriptions by Abel, Blanchard, Barlow and Mavsikalian. That was in JABA 1975. Implications of the Stereotyping and Modification of Sex Role by Nordyke, Baer, Etzel, and LeBlanc. That was published in JABA 1977. Atypical Gender Development and Psychosocial Adjustment by Rakers, JABA 1977, big year. What types of sex role behavior should behavior modifiers promote? Winkler, JABA 1977. And then finally, ABAI Statement on Conversion Therapy and Practices, which came out in 2022.
Great. Thank you.
You bet.
So when we come to today's episode, briefly, what we talked about before was the idea of the expression of concern by LeBlanc and Sayab on the article we will not be discussing, Rakers and Lovaas 73. An expression of concern is not a retraction, which would be to state that what is in this paper is no longer is not valid, used false information, false, incorrect tools, and no longer is you can't post to it anymore. It's got retraction all over it. Whereas expression of concern is more a statement of there are things in this article that would not be considered appropriate now. However, it is not fully retracted. Like what is in there is in there. However, there's going to be a statement in front of it. So you can't necessarily access the article without seeing this expression of concern. So it's going to be linked to why we are concerned, why we don't agree with this article, but it is not removed, so say, from the database, which could happen with the retraction. And certainly one of the concerns that we talked about was that this is not like the only paper that behavior analysis ever wrote on the subject of conversion therapy. We have these other ones and these responses. And this is not an exhaustive list. Many of the people who did publish, so Barlow, for example, who did publish on conversion therapy, even Stephen Hayes from ACT, he researched around conversion therapy. Many of them have gone on to express regrets, though, again, whether or not you think that their regret statements or apologies are as apologetic as maybe they should be is up to you to look up and find. And then, Rekers certainly being one of the few that published and then continued to purport that what he did was right and he was right for doing so, and there was nothing wrong with that article. And again, that was back in the 70s, so not able to publish about that now in the modern day. So that's sort of where we left off, and our listeners voted and said they would like us to continue this discussion. So here we are. So I'd love to start with our ABAI statement of concern. Has everyone read this previously or prior to getting ready for this episode?
We're all nodding.
It was relatively, I think It was still relatively, or just been recently agreed upon, I think, when we did our original episode on this topic, or maybe been a few months, but it's been getting probably closer to a year than not at this point. Would anyone like to kind of briefly sum up sort of the key components from that statement?
One thing because it relates to this, one reason, because you've said a couple of times that this isn't the only research, but one reason it is important that we talk about Rakers and this research is that this was from a project called the Feminine Boy Project that was funded from 1972 to 1986 by National Institute of Mental Health funds. Even after homosexuality, quote unquote, was removed as a mental health diagnosis, it then changed its statement as to target, instead of pre-homosexual behaviors, to pre-transsexual behaviors. And so this is not the only research, but it is very foundational to this misuse of our science. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that then relates to why it's important, why the expression of concern is important.
Thank you. And I think that's going to be a common theme in many of these articles of how did this get funded? And while one could say, it was a different time back then, it's some of this research, even being a different time, I am not happy that any taxpayer dollars were spent to support this, just in any number of ways of defining that phrase.
Yeah, so this statement piece reviews what the definition of conversion therapy is, and that includes looking to change individuals' sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity, or any combination thereof. It says that these conversion therapy practices are scientifically discredited. I'm just quoting right from it. They violate fundamental human rights and are known to directly harm individuals. And they go on to say ways in which they might harm, which are include anxiety, depression, and suicide. And then they give a little more like thorough examples of things that might fall underneath this category to ensure that they've sort of collected all of the potential language under which you might see those things. And it says behavior analysts should not engage in this behavior. Instead, they should plan for affirmative practices that respect and support the autonomy and identity of the individual client, end quote.
And I think for me, in looking back at these articles, I think one of the things that I found useful in sort of, thinking about this type of research was not necessarily thinking about it in terms of just this idea from the ABI statement of concern around conversion therapy, that, conversion therapy is not following the principles of the right to effective treatment. It's not working with the individual. And I think we are fortunate to be in more of a time, at least among probably people who are listening to this podcast, where this feels like kind of that no-brainer. Well, of course, that's the ethical violation, and we would never do it again. And in reading these articles and in sort of preparing for this episode, I think one of the themes that came up is the idea that it's great that we can all always want to be doing the best by our clients. But when we are working in a society that may or may not agree with what our client sees as their best interests, or when the stakeholders who may be funding our work do not agree with the interests or agree with the position or the goals for treatment of the individual client, it can put us in a very dangerous ethical quandary. And it would be easy to say, well, of course, I, as a behavior analyst, would never do that. But I'm sure a lot of people have been in a position where they, of course, would never do that and then found themselves, based on a number of factors, not thinking first about the client's rights because, I want to help them fit in, or because I think if I don't help them, as much as I like them to live in a world where this wasn't a problem, it is. So I have to change this behavior, and it has to be changed to the way that their parents or their school or their local community wants to. And while I think it, again, becomes easier to think of ways outside of that conundrum when you look at, either look at research like this and then think about alternatives, or when it is something that is a part of your own life and you've had to kind of learn how to, resolve those issues, yourself, unfortunately, because that's just a situation you've been in or environmental history you've had. That is what it is. But at the end of the day, we do have and will always have changes in society that we can't necessarily predict. And how going back to our ethical code and going back to some of the key tenets may not always keep us on, the right side of history and the right side of our clients' rights, but at least will help us improve in our ability to listen and to think of alternatives rather than, this is just how it is. There's nothing I can do. I'd love to be more ethical, but I'm trying my best. And I think that could be a real danger, because 10 years from now, I'm sure there'll be something that we all said, oh yeah, I supported someone's treatment. And 10 years from now saying, I can't believe I ever did that. That was a terrible idea. Like that was not the best idea. I felt trapped and I did it and I wish I hadn't. And now I do this, but at the time I didn't. And I'd love for all of us to be able to say, never have that situation occur for a number of reasons. And not because society doesn't change, but because we're able to think ahead and think about ethics and the supporting our client first, rather than just feeling stuck because that's just how it is.
I would just add the little caveat that even current practices where you don't, just in your current practice, you might not think that this issue is coming up. But we are sometimes responsible for teaching pronoun use and teaching, language use, including words like boy and girl. And it starts very early.
Yeah.
And we know from people who have experienced gender dysphoria that gender dysphoria starts in very, very early childhood. So even how we approach some of the basic teaching targets that we interact with relates to this.
Yeah. What toys you offer to play with during leisure time. Yeah.
Exactly. And, even just identifying clothing and identifying motivators and how that there can be parental bias, not necessarily that's exclusionary in intent, that affect how we intervene with our clients from the start. So it's important to sort of keep this not in the back of one's mind for in case I have this, but in the front of one's mind to be like, okay, I need to be responsible in how I program even the basics of language, which I think is one place where we as a field could do a lot more research in teaching these things in a more inclusive and accepting manner.
So I had put some general codes that I thought covered a lot of the research and a lot of the response papers that we're talking today. But I would love, certainly, if you think I missed any, and I think they vary, like not all of these are applicable to all of the papers we're talking about today in equal measure. I found some were specific to only one or two of the papers, but I thought they were good codes to be referring to when talking about, it's certainly the idea of conversion therapy, but more supporting the rights of our clients.
I think before we talk about the standards, we should also, remember they're called standards, that we should also talk about the core principles of our ethics code, because those 4 principles support integrity with our clients and seeing our clients for who they are, right? So remember those 4 core principles are benefiting others. So right there, right, we need to work to maximize benefits and do no harm by protecting the welfare and rights of our clients above all others, not their parents, not the school system, but the clients above all others. I think that one should be highlighted. Treating others with compassion,
Jack,
dignity.
do you have the notes open? I put them in, they're in big, bold letters.
I don't actually have the notes open.
Oh, okay. Yes, I have.
I have the ethics code open, but I don't have that.
I put always placing client interest first. I put them in big, they're in big letters.
Well, we're the same then when we think. Behaving with integrity is number 3, and ensuring our own competence, which is number 4, right? So knowing that, like Alan just mentioned, knowing that we need to be competent and understanding that, we may not know everything about our client, and we shouldn't assume that they fall under the same standards that we think of ourselves, right? So we have to make sure that we are being open-minded and we are considering what their preferences are.
That's perfect. And then Rob listed number 2, which is treating others with compassion, dignity, and respect. And then he bolded, especially when providing services to vulnerable populations. And I just never realized how straight from the Belmont report these are.
Very straight from the Belmont.
Which is great. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just never put that together.
Do you guys want to mention what the Belmont report is? Because it's not something I really had thought much about since undergrad psych, and then when I started serving on the IRB.
Yeah, so the Belmont report is 1935, I believe, and puts forward the core principles by which we should be acting when we're involving any persons in research, and 3 main areas, and they are beneficence, respect for persons.
The third one to be named later.
The Belmont report is 1974.
Oh, did I reverse my numbers?
I don't know, but you said 1930 something.
I was going to say, I thought it was a 70s thing.
I made that number up.
Okay, I was like, that's what I was looking up.
Post all the articles we're discussing today. 70, whatever.
Justice.
It's actually 1979. Belmont report is 1979, and it's beneficence, respect for persons, and
justice.
Justice.
Yes. Yeah. My bad. I don't know where I got my other number from.
You said it with such confidence. I wasn't going to question you.
Okay, carrying on. It's good, though. I'm glad that we're pulling from the Belmont report when we're talking about ethics.
So when looking at, I had a couple, but we can all kind of share ones that I think the ones that jumped out at me is yes, these are the standards that are missing in many of the articles we're talking about today, and that we should be thinking of when we're talking about working with the vulnerable population, which includes the LGBTQIA plus communities, but certainly practicing in the scope of competence 1.05. Specifically in terms of working with populations. And I went back and forth on that one because I did feel that the scope of competence was relevant, but not necessarily in the sense of, I wasn't quite sure where the competence part of it was, because while there are specific,
I think it's the responsibility of the field.
Okay.
Right? Because all of these individual researchers were like, oh, I'm totally competent in this area.
Yes, it definitely is in, like, I know certainly the Barlow report, it feels like I know what I'm doing. And you're like, you're basing your research on 2 papers that have nothing to do with what it is you are trying to do.
Yeah,
this is
so
disgusting.
That's extremely dangerous that can happen, and it does happen, and it can happen. So I think it's also the responsibility of the field to say this should not be within anyone's competence who's working in our area, because this is not something we should be doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that component certainly is. Certainly 107, cultural responsiveness and diversity. Our ability to evaluate our own biases, which many of the authors were not doing. And some of them changed their tune, but some of them never did. And they never wanted to look at their own biases. 108, non-discrimination. And then again, 110, awareness of personal biases and challenges. It's something important enough that it's in there twice, directly and implied. And then certainly, I think responsibility in practice, the idea of involving our clients and involving stakeholders, but very specifically in clients, in selecting the goals and interventions. It's 209. Informed consent was, I think, the reason that we're probably only going to see the expression of concern for Reckers and Lovaas, because that was one of the key problems, is that this was a young child. Could that child give informed consent for any of the treatments? And there was a more specific discussion of the use of aversives, use of punishment in the research paper, which came up a little bit in some of these papers, but not all of them. And it was not as descript. So they might just be able to skirt under the radar because they don't have those components, but that is always going to be an important component. And then 214 and 215, looking at designing and implementing behavior change interventions based on scientific evidence, which the papers we'll discuss today, most of them do not have a great body of scientific evidence they are pulling from, and a focus on positive reinforcement, and then minimizing any risk of behavior change interventions, which again was a huge concern with the child in the Reckers and Lovaas study, who then later on in life had a number of mental issues, depression, and then ultimately committed suicide. And then responsibility to our clients and stakeholders. Again, some of this is similar to what we talked about in terms of our own responsibility in practice, but again, a responsibility to clients to do no harm, making sure we're accepting clients within a scope of competence. And I think advocating for appropriate services, 312, was also important, because so many of these studies you look back on now and say, why didn't they focus on appropriate education and appropriate ways that they could support their own development as individuals with their own specific needs and rights, instead of just, well, you're right, this isn't what the majority likes, so we'll give you a treatment for it. That you're the problem, we'll fix you, right? Kind of being the subtext of most of the articles we'll be discussing tonight. I also thought 603, research and service delivery, was relevant. Activities that client welfare is prioritized, because in almost none of the articles, certainly not Reckers and Lovaas, but almost all the articles we're discussing, it almost feels like the authors were just like, this will be cool. What's a population we could do this research on? And we're just sort of taking advantage of individuals who were probably facing a lot of social pressures to not be themselves and to not love who they loved. And great, we can use them to test out these crazy theories that we have. And almost all of these studies read like that.
Well, and because it was important to the rebuttal article that my reading was focused on, because he makes some very overt statements about parent decision and individual rights. So I looked up just the APA like the 53 standards that would have been in place at the time. And it's interesting because it's very clear. They say that when you're working with the client, when you have to work with the relative or the guardian responsible for the client, that the principle of respecting the freedom of the individual should be followed, even in those circumstances. That it is of the utmost importance that the integrity and freedom and the welfare of the client is like a cardinal obligation. Mm-hmm. So even as in like that idea of the integrity and freedom of the individual was definitely in place in the field at the time, so that we're not just looking back from our own lens, that no, this was very much the professional opinion about how we should work with clients, even at the time, with some important subtleties, obviously.
I was pleased. I hope that we're going to spend more time on these articles that are calling into question in the time period what was going on, rather than the ones that are really focused on what we are most concerned about ethically here, because there's not that much to say about them, to be honest, right? Like I personally don't want to go into like tons of detail about what these researchers did. I think we as a group can learn more by focusing on the folks who called this out in the time period. And it was, I always heard about the Rakers and Lovaas study, but I didn't realize that there were other people in the time who were saying, no, what is this? And why are you guys doing this? So that was good in that sense. And I think that allows us to think about this and draw parallels, right, to our own time period now too. So I'm glad, Alan, to hear as well that the APA positioning, there was at least some statement at the time.
Well, yeah, and the APA has a very nice summary of like how they specifically over time have evolved their opinions on what we would call the LGBTQIA plus community. They have that shows excerpts from the time of how like they have evolved. And I really recommend people explore that because it's very clear that there were people in charge at high levels that would have been decrying this research from fairly early on. Yeah. And it's very much shows that this is, and it still is, an ongoing conversation about how we pathologize versus intervene.
Mm-hmm. Well put.
Yeah. Well, why don't we take a couple minutes to just kind of quickly go over the two research articles that have not been covered. Again, if you've come to our show and saying, I love when they go into deep detail about the research, we won't be doing that because honestly, it was hard to get through these articles for a number of reasons. They are very dated in almost every aspect of what's in them. But I think we could briefly discuss what they did and the ethical concerns with them, whether or not they deserve their own expression of concern, or in our opinion, it's worth even having that discussion. Then we'll take our break and then we can come back and we'll talk about our kind of response articles as sort of a group.
So let's do these each in 2 minutes.
Well, I don't think we need to give them. I don't think we need to just do 2 minutes.
Like You're on the clock.
Total. I think tick, 2 minutes. We don't need more than 2 minutes to discuss what happened. Why don't you start, Diana? Because yours you can definitely do in less than 2 minutes.
Great. Can I just look at your slides there? No.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So I read the Able 1975 article, and this one was a little bit different in that it was really largely descriptive. They had 3 individuals with a variety of backgrounds, and they had a newfangled tool, I think. I don't know if it's newfangled, that they were using to measure penile erections. And they wanted to test to see if they could sort of sort out what aspect of the scenarios that were being presented were most arousing for the individuals.
Number one, that's gross, by the way, that's going to be your research, right? Yeah, like, can you imagine going to like a party and being like, hey, what do you study? Oh, just erections.
Right. And I mean, there's a whole, field that looks at sexuality and that's fine.
That's not us. Just putting it out there.
Not usually us, but the undercurrent or undertone of these here is that there was some sort of quote unquote deviant component of arousal for these individuals, and they wanted to figure out what it was. They did not do any type of planned intervention here, at least in this study, but one sort of would conclude that would be the next step that they would take, but that's not what's discussed here.
This definitely had a subtext of deviant behavior. What we mean is homosexuality, and this is like our test run. Like once we get our penile circumference machine, correctly calibrated, then we'll be able to help, quote unquote, those attracted to same sex partners.
It's a penile plethysmograph, or a PPG.
Thank you. Okay.
That's my favorite dinosaur, the plethysmograph.
Yeah, well, but it's important because there's also a vaginal protoplethysmogram, I think it is, which is the vaginal counterpart.
Yes,
measuring blood flow for arousal is what's important to these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read this type of research in undergrad. I remember it coming up then.
There was some research on looking at people who'd been convicted of sex offenses, and looking at their arousal patterns. I feel like it was a Babbitt social talk where they discussed treatment for individuals who did have illegal sexual, I don't know if sexual deviation is the right word in that context, but they did. Yeah, that was what it was being used for. Was the last time I'd heard of it.
Harmful paraphilias.
Thank you, Alan. Harmful paraphilias. Yes.
Yeah. And the reason that PPG and VPPG is important is because these were talking about like, why would they do this? Well, these people were also like giving this information and using this research to like help governments identify people that would have been labeled homosexuals, to out them, blackmail them, bar them from civil service. So this was horrifically misused research from the get-go.
Yeah.
All right. And it reads like that was the point of it. It does have
that undercurrent to it. Yeah. And I will spare you all the details of the study.
You're not going to read page after page after page of descriptions of more and more specific sexual situations?
I'm not, but the experimenter read these out loud to the participants in the study, which is surprising. It's had 2 grants, funded by 2 different grants. That's all I'm going to say about it.
All right. So I liked your conclusion. We could learn so much with our penis measurer. Seems to be the conclusion of the article. So again, I think kind of, Alan, that historical context makes this even more inappropriate insidious than just reading it. Yes. Insidious. Yeah, it's much more pernicious in that regard. I don't know if this would be an article I would be like, we've got to get an expression of concern about this article, because it just feels very like there was a context to it at the time, but it also was just a very strange study, just reading the paper out of that context. So again, I think that might be one that we can just sort of leave in the dustbin of history, more so than some of the others. All right. So really quickly, I can't be as fast. I don't think I'll be as fast as Diana, but just I can't. I'll try to try. I can't promise I'll try, but I'll try to try. The Barlow and Agris. So this was looking at stimulus fading for, at the time, the term there was the sexual deviance. And I think there were a lot of problems with this article. Number one, in terms of reading through the article, the first one I noticed was that this was viewing the idea of what they quoted as sexual deviation, so attraction to a same, and please, folks, correct me if I misuse terms, because a lot of them are from learning history, but same-sex partner, as a problem, quote unquote, a problem of stimulus control. So if only we could treat individuals to be sexually aroused in the presence of the quote unquote correct sex partner, then their homosexual tendencies would go away, right? So again, you're basing your entire research on a fallacious argument. There is no basis for it. And not only that, but you are taking and citing only 2 articles discussing the idea of stimulus fading to say, so first of all, your core tenet is incorrect. Second of all, you're basing the technology you're using on 2 articles. One was a study by Moore and Golddiamond on stimulus fading from 1964, in which they used stimulus fading to help discriminate a shape, which is a little different than sexual arousal, and some work by Terrace in 1966, which was on animals. So we've got 2 studies as the basis of your research on a fallacious assumption that had nothing to do with sexuality. So already I think we're really talking about that failure of competence in the area. This research should not have been done, regardless of the potential for harm. There was no basis for doing this research. There's no reason to be doing this. This was not appropriate. So already, big problem. The 3 subjects, again, I think when we talk about clients' rights, had come for treatment, for quote unquote treatment, for what they considered, what was labeled their homosexuality, mostly because they were just sort of concerned. You know, the first subject had kind of the most tragic ending of all of them, at least in the article, in terms of he was, depressed and frustrated, probably because he had feelings that were punished by the members of his community. The other subject, again, was also kind of having in that same situation, but also, it was mostly seemed like he'd gone through a bad breakup or a bad end of his relationship that led to a suicide attempt, but then also kind of was mentioned, but he didn't want to be that way anymore. So we're going to help him. And then again, the third subject actually seemed relatively comfortable with themselves and their sexuality, but was uneasy and anxious when dating girls and was interested in dating girls. So they thought this treatment would be effective. So basically they had, this article referred to as a strain gauge to measure the percent of a full erection each individual could get. And then they used fading what they considered stimulus fading procedures to, over time, change a picture of a male that was able to cause a high percentage of erection or high percentage towards full erection to a female. And that was the study. That was what they did. They used like a slide projector and they just slowly, took a superimposed picture of a female so that over time, the individuals were fully aroused while looking more and more at a picture of a female versus a male. That was it. That was the study. And then they had them do journals about, what were their sexual activities like. So it was this bizarre study, which to me also, just doing the study or just the idea that the study would even work or be effective would point to the idea that what one could be aroused to, the individual or the phenotype, whatever it is that you could be aroused to, is itself fluid, which would almost make the argument for even needing a study like this irrelevant. Because if one's sexual arousal could be so easily changed or could be so fluid, then what's the big problem that you would need a treatment for this back in the 70s anyway? It just seemed like a weird circular argument that, of course, we can change one's arousal patterns. But if it's that easy to change people's arousal patterns, then what are we so worried about in that case? The whole thing went through there was a dismissive tone by the authors about their clients when the treatment was only partially effective, as we would expect for our subjects. They sort of were like, well, what are you going to do? Well, this guy says he's having sex with women, so we assume that our treatment was super effective, even though the technology we're using points to it not being that effective, and that they weren't able to say, well, these people 100% erection on these types of pictures. Now it's 100% on totally different pictures. So our stimulus fading was successful. The results were never that good. And subject one even came back to them and, just wanted to stop. They started using aversives to help his homosexuality, and then stopped coming to the clinic, which, again, there's no mention of red flags. If we were so upset, like we wondered if we were supporting our client. It was almost like, well, that guy, I don't know what his problem is. He didn't like our aversive treatment, and now he's stuck in his house. They even mentioned, he reported that he almost never goes out anymore. So I'm sure there were a lot of other factors. It wasn't just this one research article. But then their conclusion is just, well, what are you going to do? Society's not ready for this. We probably needed to also give him some social skill training to get over all these problems. And at no point looked back and said, was this an appropriate treatment? Could our treatment have caused this individual harm? It was always the individual's fault for the increasingly sort of, sadder and, just depressing conditions that the individual found himself in. So again, they consider this as a successful treatment, could be used again, that, hey, you know what, we'd probably need to work on some social skills too. But the big take home was, this is a quote, you know what, this might be a good idea because, quote, this suggests that aversive techniques may not always be necessary in the treatment of homosexuality. So all this work for a study that really didn't have great results, but the big take home was, what a promising technology that may not require the use of punishment. So a lot of problems here.
And this preceded the Rakers and Lovaas 1974. This was in 1973. So I think that's also noteworthy. This might be the earliest one that we have.
Certainly in Java. Yeah. I believe it is the oldest in Java.
I just want to point out that the one of the authors, David Barlow, it's very important to note that he was with Lovaas and Rakers and involved with this like feminine boy project, and that sex typing was a very central part of his research, and that he had a gender, what was it? It's the Barlow gender specific motor test, which used stereotypes to measure gender identity by how children sit, stand, or move like boys and girls should.
I know Barlow later on was I read some of the apologies. I did not get the sense they were apologies so much as they were just like mea culpas, which is not quite the same thing, but has distanced himself from this research. I would, not necessarily in the way I think we all would have liked.
We should let people read the apology themselves and see.
That's my opinion of the apology.
What they think.
But when we're looking at relevant codes, this is completely not practicing within the scope of competence, and that they are treating a behavior using a theory that is flawed, that they may or may not know anything about, that is based on incorrect assumptions. So again, just already big red flag there about the whole study idea. They were not aware of any personal biases and challenges, which I think we could say about almost all of these. Certainly 117, cultural responsiveness and diversity. They were not addressing the needs of the individuals. They were not really minimizing the risk of behavior change interventions. And it did not seem that they then followed up with this individual to come up with a better treatment plan to support it. It was sort of like, well, that guy left. I don't know what to say. He came back and said he was depressed. I don't know. Wish we'd done this. It was a very big shrug. It was really just a shrug at the end of this article. So they were not looking to minimize risk. They were not really thinking about responsibility to clients necessarily. I mean, certainly the clients all said, I'm concerned about my homosexuality. I do not want to identify as a homosexual. So, but again, there was no idea of there could be reasons other than why might they be saying this? Not necessarily because they're like, no, I'm not. I don't want to be attracted to men so much as I'm probably punished for my attractions. So never really thinking about that as a potential treatment option, and certainly not advocating for the appropriate amount of services, because this is a treatment where, again, it's 6.03, where they were not prioritizing their client welfare. It almost felt like they just decided they got this really cool stimulus fading program they really want to try out, even though there is no reason to think this would be effective for even the purported goals of this treatment. Again, I don't think the researchers had enough, how aware were they of the problems these individuals were facing, that they could think of other reasons that they might be depressed or coming to them for support. Their basic theory was incorrect. Again, I don't think they didn't even get the sense that they thought of, if we changed the ability of one to have an erection for different sexually stimulating images, whether that would have any actual real life or real world effect. There's no basic research necessarily on this component of stimulus fading. And they never did enough, where I think that even for the subject, they used aversive techniques. They tried one thing which had only been done by them. And when that wasn't effective, they went right to aversives. They didn't try anything else. So again, I think this is a study that I may, I don't know if it's worth always worth, going to relitigate some of these past research, but I could see maybe getting an expression of concern. I think the fact that they were adults who could give consent would make it less likely that this would ever really rise to getting an expression of concern. It is not the same as the Riekers and Lobos, but it is, I think, bad science. And I think it's bad research on just on a very technical level of research beyond the larger topic that we are discussing today. It was very upsetting to read this. It wasn't 2 minutes quite, Diana, but I didn't spend as much time on going into the detail.
Thank you for sparing us that.
Also, if you're like, I want to check this out and make my own assumptions, be careful where you print this article, because there are naked pictures in this one. Multiple naked pictures, which I never thought I would see in a JABA article.
What do you know?
What do you know? So those are the research articles. Why don't we take a quick break and we'll come back and we'll discuss Riekers' response and Nordyke and Winkler's responses to the 73 study. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking about conversion therapy and ethics. And we are going to be talking about some of the response articles and what they say about the field at the time. But before we do that, I want to remind our listeners, and if you are watching this, our watchers, that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. And by listening to this episode, you're able to earn one ethics credit. All you need to do is finish listening or watching this episode and then go to the website, abainsidetrack.com, or click the link in the show notes page on your podcast player and enter in some information, including 2 code words. The first code word is cardigan, CARDIGAN. It's a type. Is it a type? It's a type of sweater, or it is a different type of clothing altogether? How does cardigan get defined?
It's like a jacket.
Okay.
Well, it's like, have you seen that parody of the Billy Idol White Wedding song? It says it's a nice day for a light sweater.
Oh,
nice day for a cardigan.
I have not. Okay.
So it's a light sweater, according to Billy Idol's parody song.
All right, good to know. Cardigan.
I was just gonna, interject and just say I think that Jackie's article definitely does a good big picture presentation, whereas Nordyke talks about the specific harms to individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's
Mine should go first.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wasn't sure if we wanted to do this one as a first, second, third, or if we more wanted to just have the general discussion, but we can do it any way y'all like.
Jackie introducing this article gives a nice framework, and then your article, although Nordyke gets a lot more cred, it's so big that we'll just talk about it naturally after that.
Right.
Okay.
Love it. All right. So Jackie, please, what was Winkler's 1977 response to records and Lobos?
I think that Winkler, 1977, would have been drinking tea, not coffee. Just putting it out there. Winkler is a tea drinker. And I think at first, Winkler would say all 5-year-olds should engage in cross-gender behavior, in his opinion. That is what I think, in my opinion, is what he would say. Because, this main article raises the question of who does the therapist have allegiance to? The client parents, or what the prevailing general societal norms are at the time. And so they wanted to discuss the Riker, I'm going to say the RNL study.
That's fine.
I think it just is more helpful for me. They wanted to discuss that study, and they suggested that it appeared that RNL were under the same assumptions of society there that said what boys should do and what girls should do. And the article argues that, rightly so, that RNL make an assumption that sex roles are natural, and they don't look at the general overall natural development of the specific individual and be what would be most beneficial to the individual, right? So that is their first stance. They suggest that RNL present their work as a way to prevent harm in the future, introduce current aversiveness. And so that's kind of their general overarching theme. But Winkler really does a nice job of saying, well, these two things don't really have any support. And I love that he's just well, let's look at these questions. The first goal would have to prove that any sort of behavior that you have as a 5-year-old is going to then 100% predict what you're going to do as an adult. And there's no research to suggest that. And then he also states that that behavior needs to then say that it would be a cause for therapy, right? That it is problematic in a sense. And then then it's very dismissive. And he's well, the second goal was that we want to reduce the aversiveness for the parents, the clients of the parents. And he's well, that's not an empirical question. Maybe what we need to do for them is to teach them to be accepting,
right?
Which I love, right? Because come on. So the evidence related to the first question is very weak. Even in the 70s, data showed that there was no differences in between these two populations. So they specifically looked at psychosis, and they said that there was no differences between a hetero or homosexual in their terminology population. The author suggests that categorization is really a largely result of society norms, which even in the 70s were changing and have now changed now, right? So the therapists were acting on what the society norms were then, but how are you going to know what the norms are going to be in 20 to 30 years when this child turns into an adult? They also make the great point that high levels of any gender may not be good, right? So this also disproves the RNL point that if the child is engaging in more feminine play and not masculine play, then, that's a bad thing, right? And Winkler points out that it's actually bad to be in one way or another, right? If you're all masculine, then you'll be very aggressive and you're not going to be able to handle more social norms and nuances, right? And if you're teaching someone to be doing all of the so-called feminine qualities, right, then they're not going to be able to show confidence and stand up for themselves in the whole over societal paradigm. So Winkler suggests that it's better to find alternative behaviors that are more neutral, and teaching from a variety of different ways to be compassionate, to be confident, to be assertive. If you have to teach anything, I do love that they put that, like, if you have to do something, why don't you teach something that is good for everyone, right? And, the authors it appears that RNL did not do their full research, right? They just pull it out there. They're like, they didn't do their research. They didn't look at what previous studies are showing about, these types of behaviors. And so what we should be doing is teaching parents to accept all types of behaviors for their children and to teach clients to assert themselves more with their parents. So there we go, right? He's pulling it in and just suggesting that, RNL didn't do what they were supposed to be doing, and we don't really need to be targeting these sorts of behaviors, but we need to be targeting other behaviors like acceptance. And this is written in 1977. So I think, it's of the time. So not everyone was like, yeah, RNL, you're killing it.
That was, I think, really good to see that there was pushback during this time period as well. That's what I said I didn't realize before, right? I feel like Winkler today would totally use the phrase like gender, the social construct, but that's a phrase of today and not of their time.
And kind of looking at Nordyke and colleagues, also response to Reckers and Lovaas, many of the points are pretty similar to Winkler. There was something about the way that Nordyke's article was written. There was like there seemed like there was a real like anger at Reckers and Lovaas, like a very appropriate one. Like some of the choices of phrase, this felt like a hot take article in a way that I don't usually see in articles. I really loved it. Like there were some phrases that you could tell, I think, in what I felt from reading old research literature, that I think Reckers was not happy with Winkler's response, but was like, well, Winkler's bringing up some.
You mean Nordyke?
No. Well, he wasn't happy with either response.
Oh, okay.
But
sorry.
In responding to Winkler, it's like, I don't know, colleague. I think your points are also in that. I think I'm right and I think you're wrong. But with the Nordyke paper, I got the sense that he was angry at it. Like it felt like it was jabbing at him in a way, which good. I'm glad. I found this to be just a great read because, again, I don't think you get a lot of papers that have as much of sort of a tone of voice as this one did. But again, some of the points were pretty similar, as Jackie, as you were talking about with Winkler, in terms of looking at are these kind of these sex type roles is really even something we should be looking at? Is there research to support that if a child engages in these behaviors, it is ever a cause for concern? It is going to lead to problems in the future. Certainly, I think Nordyke gets more into feeling like Reckers and Lovaas didn't do their homework. They're talking about, poor Craig, the subject from their paper. He's suffering from social isolation, and how they really didn't look at a lot of components to measure this or to demonstrate a change in this component that was reported of them, which also points to how they did seem to be really working for what the parents were concerned about rather than what Craig was potentially worried about. They certainly talked about, again, like Winkler was discussing the idea that we don't know that any of the behaviors Craig is engaged in will ever result in any sort of a challenge. I think this article or this discussion gets more into that idea of competence, in that if they were so concerned, or if the parents were so concerned and the researchers were interested in supporting the family and supporting their client, why did they not reach out to other professionals who might be able to give them a context or give them more guidance in terms of what they could be looking for. What should the target behaviors to change be? Why would they change them from one to another? What is the value in it? Even mentioning that, they really could have done more to talk to other people in organizations that support the rights of LGBTQIA plus community. Was not what it was called back in the 70s. What about child rights advocates? They could have looked at, more feminist groups that were growing in the 70s to sort of talk about that gender role stereotyping, the harm that could be done. Is there a harm in some of those components? Sorry, Alan. Yes.
I just want to point out that in the rebuttal, which I'll address, he had looked at those and he dismisses them as a legitimate concern. So this information was known to Rickers and all of these people at the time.
Got it.
And he makes it explicit. So just going to point that out.
No, please do. Because again, I think we don't need to spend a lot of time like, well, Rickers thought that, if he had thought based on this, I think we want to bring that in. And then certainly the idea of like the treatment goals. Why violent toys? Why would you choose that we need to teach him to play roughhouse play and play with guns? And that wasn't what the parents were even asking for. So in that regard, some of their treatment goals had nothing to do with the concerns of the parents. Certainly didn't seem to have a concern with Craig. I think, Winkler brings it up as well, but Nordyke and colleagues bring it up. The problem seemed to them less about, well, Craig engages in these certain roles and that's just not appropriate. He might become, gasp, a homosexual or trans. The issue was more, he refused to do anything else. So more one of maybe like play rigidity or maybe just sort of his own like rigidity of like play scripts. So it didn't matter what play scripts, just the idea that if he refused to play anything else or wouldn't compromise with peers, that is an actual problem that could result in social isolation or social challenges. Not because, well, he's playing house, that's the problem, but that he refuses to let anyone take certain roles in the game of house. That could be a target, right? That wasn't the target they were looking at, Rickers and Lovaas were looking at. And then even adding components into their treatment of Craig was not allowed to play with girls through the course of treatment, like, as if that was somehow, like that was the problem. He was near girls with the kind of, I think was written with sort of a pithy response, teaching the thorough avoidance of girls may in fact foster male homosexuality, not avoid it. Do we know? Which again, I don't think they were trying to make a point that it could, so much as the whole basis for which Rickers and Lovaas were coming from was one where they don't know any of this information. So everything they're trying to do, everything they're trying to do is likely misguided. They're picking things that seem right to them because of their biases as to what would constitute appropriate sex roles and appropriate boy/girl play,
which is all culture-based stereotypes.
Yeah, exactly. And really just looking at, again, that idea of also then them not really monitoring. They have an outcome that may or may not be relevant to the problem that the parents are raising, whatever perceived problem Craig might feel that is being experienced, that Craig is experiencing, that the researchers chose treatments that had to do with their own sexual stereotyping. And then the study was over and everything was all well and good, rather than actually monitoring, did the purported benefits of the treatment lead to positive outcomes? Even then, they talk about how Rickers and Lovaas are sort of, pat on the back, like we've made Craig a rough and tumble young lad, and he's going around and fighting, and his mom is so worried that he's a little roughneck. Just pointing out, like, how could you even write that in your paper?
This is all disgusting.
This is a bad outcome. So again, it was a good rebuttal to Rickers. Again, brought up the idea of personal biases and challenges, 1.10, the fact that the clients and stakeholders, even if they were, which Winkler points out, focusing on the stakeholder rather than their clients, by the end of their paper, they're not even supporting the stakeholders' goals in many ways with the treatments that they're choosing. And then again, certainly looking at minimizing the risk of behavior change intervention, which we know from his historical perspective, they certainly did not do based on the long-term harm that was done to Craig in these studies. So again, no maximized benefits 3.0 on responsibility to clients, no supporting of rights, no maximizing benefits, and doing no harm. And all of this very well pointed out in a very, I thought, again, hot take for 1977 at least, writing style, which I appreciated. Do they always, now before you get into some of the more fine points that Rickers brings up in his response, when there are those types of rebuttal papers, is the original author always given a chance? Do we know to write their own, rebuttal? Because I know I've seen some in the past, but not always.
I can't speak for always, but
all of time.
There's an editor's note that Reckers was invited by the editor as a response to the preceding articles.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's courteous. Yeah.
This was a professional courtesy extended by the editor to Reckers to be able to basically at the same time address, because this basically, I think a lot of these were all published together.
Right. Mm-hmm. So it allows the original researcher to save face by being able to put their rebuttal out at the same time rather than be blindsided by the criticism in print.
Gotcha.
Right.
But did he save face? Let's see.
No. I want to provide some important context for George Reckers. So Reckers got his BA in psychology from Westmont College, which is a private Christian, evangelical college in California that to this day still lists engaging in LGBTQ relationships as grounds for expulsion. So I think that we want to go into this knowing that Reckers himself had biases that were just there and not offering any kind of being careful to offer any kind of well, maybe he didn't understand. I'm going to say that his background clearly shows that he understood. Reckers also went on to found the Family Research Council and was a founding member or board member of NARTH, which are two they have been labeled as hate groups by the SCLC, and they are proponents of conversion therapy and anti-homosexual interventions.
Gotcha.
So Reckers, is a problematic individual, and I suggest people read up on him to see what happened later in his life that led him to step away from those. I won't state them here, but it's interesting to note what caused him to step away from those organizations. So this article, his response is very paltry at best. To Winkler specifically, he says that, well, you've criticized our selecting feminine behaviors as immoral, but you don't really base your judgment on empirical evidence. So, well, we're as empirical as you are, so stay in your lane seems to be the nature of his response. How dare you accuse me of not being empirical when your value judgments aren't based on empirical research? Which, that's a strong foundation for your research, if you ask me, in a, problematic way. They also point to research by another person that says, oh, well, for people that are sex or assigned female at birth or female sexed typed, high rigidity in feminine behaviors can lead to anxiety. So why isn't rigid feminine behavior a problem for male sexed people as well? Which again kind of ignores a large part of what the conversation is. That behaviors and identity are kind of separate, and then you can easily make another step forward is that voluntary participation in these by children is different than adult women in having to engage in these behaviors. But it's very much just sticking the wool in one's ears and saying, well, if it's bad for what's bad for one's bad for the other. So, how dare you misinterpret my research? And then, more than to sort of both Winkler and Nordyke, he says that the assumption that social values about sex typing have changed is also lacking in empirical evidence, and that they are only given oblique examples like feminists and homosexuals in their writing. And so that criticism is just not worth it, because that's an obscure set of people. They're not mainstream. And so that does not undermine the social validity of our intervention. That even if there were poor outcomes for a research participant, it's still not valid to say that cross-gender identified children be allowed to transition because that support does not exist. And basically says that, society is not accepting. So what's more valid? teaching the individual to engage in socially appropriate behaviors, or to give people a false sense of hope as they develop into adulthood that society will accept them, when society won't make those changes in these people's lifetimes. Which again, not a strong foundation.
Right.
To
sort of a big claim to make. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a big claim to make, that like you're basically enabling these people's like fantasy behavior rather than teaching them the real world. Which for people who are involved in some of the current anti-LGBT efforts, they make those same claims are still made by these people. So basically, he re-summarizes his arguments for why his research is valid. It's one that engaging in behaviors that are different from one's assigned sex leads to ostracism. It is therefore maladjusted and therefore fit for correction on social validity terms. That parental desire can and should be a valid basis for intervention rather than the vague consideration for a child's mental well-being, and specifically gives the example of like a parent with strong religious beliefs dictating their children's intervention, which again is, I think even at the time, not an uncontroversial opinion. He just is making a statement that, well, we let people do this, so why is this any different? And then lastly, that wanting to transition medically is, in the current medical parlance, identified as risky and unhealthy. So it's legitimate to prevent medical transition or the desire to medically transition later through behavior modification. And even says that medical transition for a child is not legally elective and is not cosmetic in the same way that wart removal is. And so basically says it's not the same thing. And again, doesn't talk about like the complex process by which I think even at the time medical transition it wasn't simply a child says, I want to medically transition specifically to receive a penectomy. And therefore, the child says it happens. That's immoral, right? Well, yes, but that wasn't happening even in the 70s. Like there were protocols in place about mental health. I don't think there was any doctor engaging in gender reassignment surgery at the time, simply with children, just because the child says, I want it. It's like, okay, well, then we'll do it. It's perfectly moral, legal. It's fine. Mm-hmm. So just, paints that broad brush. And then, he criticizes both Winkler and Nordyke for fostering homosexuality, transsexualism, and transvesticism in children, that's immoral. So again,
and you still hear those same arguments to today. And it's not as though this has gone away, right? So like we're talking about as though like conversion therapy was something that happened in the past, right? And we as a field hopefully have moved on from it. But this is ongoing, not necessarily underneath our umbrella, but it's bigger than that, and it's out there in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it is. That's the thing. It is because on the medical and psychological side, this battle has been lost, and that we do have like gender transition algorithms that are approved internationally and like nationally by the American Medical Association. There is gender dysphoria treatments that are about like acceptance and identity-based motivations. That battle has been lost currently in those mainstream communities. So now it's like, well, we've got to fight this battle societally.
Yeah.
So it's very unfortunate.
Mm. Yep.
So, and to anyone listening, I obviously have very strong motivations. I myself am not transgender. I have people in my life that are important to me that are. I grew up identifying as gay. I'm currently working on developing myself as just queer activist and a queer person generally, so that even like the label gay is not as relevant to me anymore. So I'm passionate about this in a way that people would say, oh, well, you're as biased as as Rakers is, but there's a difference.
Yes, thank you, Alan. I think one of the pieces that kind of you brought up in discussing Rakers, Alan, is this does have that weird argument of like, well, my targets aren't good. My targets don't lack research. Well, you're making statements that don't have research either. Therefore, what, mine are right? I mean, again, Nordyke and Winkler are responding to concerns. I think the amount of evidence they would need to share of like, look, all this research on how when children engage in these sex roles, they go on to have perfectly, happy lives. Like the strength of research and the evidence burden is not on them. It is on him. And so much of his, points of debate are like, well, you don't have those numbers, so I shouldn't have to have those numbers either. But he did this treatment. He already did the treatment. It just feels very, like he's trying to come up with an excuse. I completely.
I don't think it's about numbers. I think it's about ethics as well. Because if he were to come back and be like, look at all these studies I've done that quote unquote proved that you can make this change, it doesn't prove that.
No, and so I didn't mean numbers in that regard. I just was looking for more the idea that their statements are these concerns. The fact that they can't quote unquote prove that they aren't concerns makes their point invalid. However, his would therefore still be valid because he made it first, or because that's what society wants. We would be kind of probably some of the other excuses that come up.
Well, and I just also want to point out that this isn't the time. This isn't before the APA has identified the sort of proto-gay rights, LGBTQ rights as important. This is after. In 1973, the APA said that homosexuality per se implies no impairment in judgment, stability, reliability, or general social or vocational capability, and all mental health professionals need to take the lead in removing the stigma of mental illness associated with homosexual orientations, and then also make a policy statement that discrimination against these people in any walk of life, whether it's housing, accommodation, licensing, is immoral, that people who engage in quote unquote homosexual activities are not bad people, and it is not legitimate to discriminate against these people for this reason. This is 1973 when the APA has said this. So this research feels as if it's after the fact, like, oh, well, like we hold these beliefs and we're trying to sort of push back against what has been accepted. So again, Raker's saying that like, oh, well, you're not making legitimate statements to people like Winkler and Nordyke. It's like, well, no, like they're representing what the professional guidance says is the standard to some extent.
Well, I think it's about time we move into dissemination station. There it is. So again, this is not an episode.
Train today.
It's geez, look at the time. This is certainly not an episode where we're like, and what did we learn today? Well, penile circumference machine. Like that is not going to be. I mean, we did learn some things about old research. That's true. But the key here is going to be, what did we learn that I think is relatable in terms of ethics, in terms of how behavior analysis can continue to support.
So can I go?
Yeah, I was just doing the preamble, but yes, please go.
So I think that we all probably entered into this with the same opinion regarding this research, but to me that there are clear parallels that we can draw here between the understanding of some of these researchers in the 1970s saying, as a society, we state that these things are bad/wrong, and so we can use these technologies to change them. And we can see different behavior being produced based on those changes, and therefore we have quote unquote succeeded, right? There are parallels to that in what we see working with autistic populations today, where we say the behavior you engage in is quote unquote wrong/different from the majority of the population. Therefore, I'm going to go in, make these changes, see different behavior occurring now, and then that will mean that I quote unquote succeeded. So that's not going to be true for every single instance, but there may be some times where we try to produce a behavior change. We see the person engaging in new and different behavior, and we say, look, they now fit in more, right? But it doesn't mean that we changed that person. If they were autistic, then they remain autistic, right? So if we just changed behavior topographically, we haven't actually produced a change. The argument that the change should have occurred at all is highly in question, and we've likely created additional mental anguish for that person.
Thank you for stating that explicitly, Diana, and drawing that parallel, especially since there's just a higher incidence of identifying with LGBTQ among the autistic population and vice versa.
Yes. Yes. Good observation too.
Mm-hmm. Jackie or Alan, kind of some concluding thoughts.
People at the time, I learned, and I think it's very evident, people at the time knew that this was bad junk science and that it was harmful, and that these people who were engaging in this research were doing harm and kind of existing in an echo chamber that was biased politically, potentially by religious ideas. And so it isn't as if we have had all this grand realization since then. It was known at the time that this was harmful. And it's a shame that this was ever greenlit for funding, especially federal funding, because it did a lot of harm.
Yeah.
Jackie, any concluding thoughts?
I think the only thing that I want to say too is that when we are working with our clients, like we spoke about, we should be we shouldn't be narrowing our focus down, right? We should be using items that everyone can use, right? So we should be making sure too that we aren't accidentally mislabeling our clients or misgendering our clients, even if their parents or the school system does that, right? So that's something that we should be really thoughtful about, no matter what age they are. I think that's important to do, and to praise and love them for who they are, right? And to respect what they love, right? Because I would want someone to respect what I love. If you love something, you should love it. Bam.
Yeah, there you go.
Great.
I think kind of going back to these articles and going back to this as a topic and saying, there are a lot of positives and a lot of, certainly, I think society leaps and bounds better at that acceptance. There's still work to be done, which we've talked about on previous episodes. I think another, kind of looking at the ethics is really focusing, when they say, hey, focus on the rights of your client, that's not just a be nice to your client statement. That does entail looking at factors and looking as strength-based treatments for your client to avoid ever potentially finding yourself in a situation where you feel, well, I had to change their behavior, like you were talking about, Diana, like we talked about at the top of the show, when the problem might not be one of behavior, but of the social environment. And, as much as one could wring their hands like Rikers partially did and say, what are you going to do, society? That's not an excuse to harm your client at all or to set goals that are inappropriate. I think for folks who are interested in reading more on this general topic, but I don't think you need to go back necessarily and read these articles to sort of look at why they potentially might not have been part of the same discussion as Rikers and Lovaas, why they're part of our discussion today. But I know a friend of the show and previous, and hopefully, he'll come back on the show again, guest Cody Morris and colleagues Getz and Gabrielle Black wrote an article for BAP in 2021 that reviewed the treatment of LGBTQ plus individuals historically in a number of behavior analytic journals beyond just JABA, which is where we were focusing our discussion. And in sort of thinking about how we might do, in a future follow-up episode, we're not quite sure when it's going to come out, but kind of continuing to look at how behavior analysts can support the LGBTQIA plus community. There was and I'm not sure if we'd ever mentioned it before, but there was a 2019 article in BAP by, again, friend and previous guest of the show, Werner Leland, and colleague, so Leland and Stockwell, where a self-assessment tool for practitioners for looking at the transgender, nonconforming, affirming clinical skills self-assessment tool as a means to review one's own practices, biases, which we talked about a lot as an ethical code that was missing in the articles discussed tonight, and then actions relating to supporting transgender individuals, and then helping practitioners look at where they can continue their own growth as professionals who are interested in supporting rather than inadvertently harming this community. So I think we'd like to maybe have that on as a full episode or more discussion. But in the meantime, since we're not making that today, please take a look at that article as well. All right. So to wrap up, we're going to end with our last segment, our pairings segment.
There's no sound effect for pairings. Sorry.
Should we go like glug, glug, glug?
No.
I think you should go.
Okay, great.
So it's like the Wayne's World Dream music. Let's do that.
All right. So, there's nothing clever to do, I think, as far as eating or drinking for this episode. So I really just suggest that you enjoy something that is either a strong drink or something that makes you feel kind of refreshed after this particular conversation. So you could go one of two directions here. You could have something like a very strong whiskey, or maybe you'd like a glass of like cucumber. Those are really my two recommendations. As far as episodes go, I have several, and that's what I was doing. I was looking up another one I forgot when you said that. So if you thought that this episode is something you want to hear more about, I have others that you might also want to listen to. You could do episode 219, which was a call to action on Rakers and Lovas. That's the one Rob referenced earlier with Sarah Campo and Matt Capriati. You could also go back and listen to episode 94, where we talked about gender diversity in ABA with Aaron Donovan and Kristen Lancaster. You might also want to visit episode 134, which is Trauma-Informed Care with Brian Middleton, who's also the bearded behaviorist. You could check in on episode 163, which was about LGBTQ plus communities in ABA. That was with Camille Morgan. Or you might want to check out episode 147, which was sexual well-being. That was with Warner Leland and Barb Gross. Yes, so there are lots there that you might be able to revisit or visit for the first time.
And by or you mean and. Revisit them all. Collect them all.
All right, that's it.
And book club episodes.
Oh, yes. Well, Alan, wait, would you like to? Alan, you want to do our book club plug? We got that coming up.
No, I wasn't prepared for that. I just, in case they like my contributions, that's another place you can get more of me.
Absolutely.
Well, they definitely, right. and I we should also mention, I think I mentioned it offhanded, but not necessarily in the episode 219 with Sarah and Matt. We also, Alan joined us for that discussion as well. I did. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. So we want to say to everyone out there, I got a frog climbing on me if you're watching the video. How nice. Otherwise,
he's here to remind you of something.
Theater of the mind. What is he here to remind me of? Oh, yeah. I'll get to that, frog. So a couple things. Certainly, we want to say thank you to everyone out there for listening. If you are watching this, we want to say an extra special thank you because that means you subscribe to us on Patreon, which we really appreciate as well. Remember, if you are a subscriber on Patreon at the $5 level, you get access to these quarterly live recordings. You can watch us make them. You can watch the video afterwards. In any way, you will also get a code. Only if you're watching the video, though. You can't just get this in your podcast player for a free CE, and in this case, a free ethics CE. So if you were saying, oh, Patreon, that sounds fun. Maybe I'll try it out with my ABA Inside Track friends. Go for it. That's one reason. The second reason that Alan already mentioned is you probably loved everything he had to say on this episode and other episodes he's been on. And you say, I need like 2 hours of that guy just going off, but not about articles. I want to hear him talk about books. And if you are in that Venn diagram, well, you can join us on Patreon at the $10 level and get our quarterly book clubs, which means not only will you get our upcoming book club, which we have not recorded, we'll be recording in the spring on the skepticism book, Calling Bullshit, which was voted on by our patrons. But you can also get access to every other book club we've done, from our very first book club, Meaningful Differences, to our most recent recorded book club on Between Now and Dreams, so parenting an autistic child. You can get us plus Alan on all of those, going over 2 hours. Also, you can get 2 CEs for listening to those, no additional charge, just as a thank you for subscribing to us on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. For everybody else, you're getting this episode like a couple weeks later. You're missing out on all these great visuals. It's okay. You still get the awesome content of this episode, and we appreciate your subscribing and following us on social media, sending us emails at abainsidetrack.com, looking at these episodes on YouTube, however you connect with us. But again, lots of great ways. But that Patreon way, if you need more Alan today, that 219, I guess, would be one way. But that book club, that would be the next best way to do it. So I guess that brings us to the last place you can find us, which is our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can find all of our old episodes, links to the articles discussed today, though I don't know if you want to look at too many of them. Look at that Nordyke, look at Winkler. You're probably good. Don't need to read the rest of those. You can just listen to our discussion. I think you're fine. But you can also purchase CEs, which I'm going to give you the second secret code word when I scroll to the top of my notes. It is, it's frog. It's right here. Frog. The frog that's on my shoulder. Not a real frog. It's a stuffed frog. That is the amphibian. They jump. Frog. F-R-O-G. Our second secret code word. All right. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't wrap up by, of course, saying thanks to Jackie and Diana and to Alan for being on tonight's episode. Thanks to you for listening and watching, everyone out there. Also, thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturry for interstitial music, and to Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his fabulous editing work. We will be back next week with another full-length episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.